Welcome back. Another episode of RX Radio. I'm your host, Jiunta and Shallow, the antidote to boomer fitness. And oh my God, what a week for it. We're not in the interest of naming names, but if you're keeping finger on the pulse of what old people are talking about on the internet when it comes to health and fitness, we had a week. Sort of one of those if you know type deals. So if you want to make sure that old people don't ruin the one thing that we have left, because we'll never own our own homes, be sure to send this to friends who also don't like old people talking about fitness stuff. So put down your Zone 2 cardio, pick up your weights. This is another episode of RX Radio. In the interest of that, co-host and close friend of the show, let's say co-founder, Dr. Jordan Jiunta and myself sat down and we talk about warming up. And we talk about warming up for people without a 401k. We talk about warming up for people who are still strong. So going over the principles of warming up, again, we just let the old people take over. So how is it that you're going to warm up upper body, lower body, in a way that's expedient, in a way that's effective, and in a way that decreases the amount of time you waste in the gym, which, let's start with the warm up and then let's work to the rest of your workout in future episodes is to see what are our opportunities to waste less time. Because man, when I go into a gym, I see a lot of time wasted. Now we have more time than our old boomer counterparts, but let's not squander it, shall we? Let's figure out ways to get all of these people into old folks' homes and out of the fitness podcasting space. So a share or a like or one of those Instagram things from Spotify. And we're on YouTube as well, so you can kind of see the live ramblings on YouTube. So do be sure to check that out. But every time you share or like or comment on an RX Radio post, you send a boomer fitness podcaster into a home. And I think that's a cause worth getting behind. So without any further ado, how to warm up not like an old person. RX Radio. Enjoy. Lundy, hit it.
You're tuned in to RX Radio.
It's the little things as you get older,
It is.
I think, when you train for longer, you get older faster. Like because I'm always in a place where I have relatively more experience than everyone else there, devoid of age. Like you get the head nod from the old guy in the stringer with a leather belt from the 70s that uses sponges instead of gloves for some reason, or the gardening glove guy who's worn the same blue sweatpants. But like for the most part, if you're in your 30s and you started weight training when in high school, let's say, like you're the 1% of the 1%. Of like physical equity. And it's like, because I watch people come in their, in their 30s and start resistance training, right? Like I have a network of friends outside of fitness who are, they've gone into business and they've started families and they've just reprioritized their life, maybe conventionally in a better way than we have. They've prioritized their life where we prioritize training for our life. Yes. And you watch them come in and they're not really that strong. So they can just start lifting weights. And it's like you're trying to instruct them on how to lift weights. Well, meanwhile, you're kind of moving around a bit. They're like, whoa. Hey there, friend. We're going to take a few minutes here. And we're going to we're going to move things around a bit. And they're like, I don't feel like I have to. And you're like, you don't. You're right. You absolutely don't. But you will. And it's funny because I remember training and we've talked about our inception stories of training. I remember my first workout, there was no warm up. I was also 16, 15 years old, whatever it was. And it's there becomes a point in everyone's lifting career where the warm up kind of really becomes indicative of your understanding about training on the whole, right? You learn, it's quite literally, I think warm ups are a really good representation of the Dunning-Kruger effect of training at large, right? Nothing about training, you don't warm up. You learn a little bit about training, you're warming up for an hour. Yeah. And then as you learn more about training, your warm-ups kind of track. And then you learn a lot and then you super specialize, like you're an Olympic weightlifter or a power lifter, and you get good and you get experience and you get more knowledge. And then all of a sudden the warm-ups start to creep up again. You're just like, oh, fuck. So it's an interesting proxy to a training intelligence. And I think it's something where, there's a lot of resources out there for people to look at, the contents of your workout, especially now more than ever with YouTube and podcasts. But I think one of the ways you can actually skip the queue is if there was a resource to talk about warming up at different stages of your lifting career, what's expected, what you could avoid, like what are the pitfalls. So I think that's what I think I want to dedicate some time to today is like, all right, how do we contextualize the warm up in your lifting career? So let's like identify where you're at, what you're trying to get done, and what's the straightest line to get there.
Yeah, I like that idea. And the words that you use, training intelligence, I really like that idea a lot because to me, training and warm ups really, they represent an awareness process and a learning process the entire time. And the more advanced you get in your training career, the higher your training age, the more performance oriented that your goals are, the more aware that you have to be. So you can make those slight tweaks and those slight adjustments as you go through your warm up. And you're honestly learning how to use your body better so you can be more effective at completing whatever that task is. So I really like the idea of training intelligence and your warm up being a representation of that. Because what is your warm up aside from preparing you to execute on a task to be as effective as possible? So to do that, you need a relatively intimate understanding of what you're trying to accomplish, what the pitfalls are going to be, what the limitations are going to be in that. And that takes experience. That takes time to get to a place where you've refined that. You can real time assess that. And that's why that's a good analogy that you made to the Dunning-Kruger effect. Because like at first you're like, the whole thing is learning. You're learning how to exercise, right? When you have no training experiences, you just hop into the gym and you push on the handles in a machine or you grab some dumbbells and do what the guy next to you is doing. And you just kind of figure it out. Is you have no awareness because all it is learning. And then you get to that place where you're like, oh shit, like, all right, I need to worry about technique because maybe you had an injury or you're reaching training plateaus. So you kind of take a step back and you assess what you're actually doing in the gym. And then that's the place where you fall into that valley where you have no idea what the fuck's going on about anything. So you take all the information you can get and you apply it all at once. And it's really this vetting process of taking that information and then starting to understand where it ranks and how it applies. Is how important is a banded distraction? How much hacky sack do I have to play before I go and squat? Or can I just go and do some unilateral stuff, understand how my hips working, understanding if there's a limitation anywhere, address the specific limitations you have, and then go do the thing.
Yeah, I think it's always twofold, right? It's about understanding the starting point of the body you're working with. And it's difficult as someone who's like not a trainer or a coach because you don't really understand the variability in human potential and expression. And you've never seen someone or you've never been in the room or observed someone who's in their 80s trying to move or get into some of these positions. You don't understand like, well, you've seen this obviously from a clinical standpoint where people come in and they'll ask you like, I have to be like the tightest person you've ever seen. It's like, it's 10 a.m. and you're not even the tightest person I've seen today. Like
Right.
People just don't really understand. And we have a unique vantage point being clinicians and working with, bodies in some capacity from a personal training into the clinical world for, I don't know, 15 years, maybe over half our lives now.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at, the variability of, human expression when it comes to motion, it's very broad. I think it's very broad from, the elderly or the post surgery to the spry, just gazelle like 16-year-old athlete. It's like there's a huge range here. So I think understanding that like most people, yeah, you probably aren't special, which is like a really
Yeah.
good thing to understand. Because
Yeah.
here's the thing, we want to move from general to specific, right? But general, and I don't really like that term, and I don't maybe fix it on the fly. You want to move from specific to more specific,
Mm.
right? So general to specific usually means when people enter into a phase of their training where they know enough and they've kind of been heeded the warnings by people who have gone through this process, like, hey, you should probably consider warming up. And then, like you said, they kind of get into everything. They go on TikTok or they go on Instagram or they go on YouTube and they start to like find like just very generic search terms, right? Hip mobility drill, shoulder mobility or whatever. And they kind of just start to piecemeal together, not understanding that like, look, this is very general. Like this is too general for you in some cases. Now, novelty does play an effect. And it's like novelty is different than specific variability. And I think that's a key component in exercise, right? So specific variability should be the goal. But a lot of times people just fall in the way of novelty. They just go, this is new, I like this. It's like, no, no, no. What your body actually likes isn't something specific about that banded distraction or that static stretch or that foam roll. What your body is actually taking to is the specific or variable position that you're in, right? And it being a new position. So people will get a new stretch or a new activation drill. And the thing that the body takes to is the newness of the drill, not the activation or the band or whatever. It's the variability. So when we look at putting together, a warm-up routine, I think number one, understanding you're not special. Right. So but that's
in
huge.
Life.
That's in life, just across the board. Like, screw what your mom said. Like it was all a lie. If you don't know that, you'll learn it. And if you haven't learned it yet, it's coming. Yeah. So when we think about that, get that out of the way. You're not special. Great. We want to, I think there's two things that come to mind when I think of like, what is the goal of a warm-up? And that list will definitely expand. For me, I think the magic of the warm-up, one of the magics of the warm-up is the idea of temperature. And there's some pretty good research to back this. Like, I think one thing that has gotten lost in the shiny red ball syndrome around warm-ups and activation drills and that is like, you see a lot of novelty across shoulder, hip, spine, whatever. And people actually miss the namesake value of the warm-up, which is pretty well documented, which is actually increasing core body temperature, right? Like I watch people warm up in short shorts and a stringer, and it's like, you're missing it. Like I gear down every session. And I've been doing this since before the onset of said pump cover. But it kind of makes a lot of sense. So like, I think if you're putting together a warm-up plan, if you're listening to this, be like, hey, I want to put together a warm-up for me. One, you're not special. Two, one of the main objective outcomes is be warm, increase core body temperature. So what does that look like? How can either the total volume of the specific exercises I'm doing or the intensity of them or some combination actually be at a level of exertion that's getting me close and ready to that level of exertion that I'm going to be, using for my actual training session. So that's thing number one on my list. Number two is awareness. Like you kind of alluded to it earlier, but this is body awareness. This is spatial awareness. It's like, can I have, because I think if I look across the board at things that regardless of as you move from specific to more specific, specific in early stages can be specific to the type of workout you're doing or specific to the joint that you're warming up. But as we move more specific, these things are always going to be true, right? Even from a beginner getting into warming up, as their maximal load that they're working with is greater and their relative strength increases. A general trend or a general theme you're going to see is, regardless of if it's an Olympic athlete or a person getting into working out, be warm, increase core body temperature. That's part of it. Two is the goal is joint sense. The goal is spatial awareness, proprioception, kinesthetic awareness, whatever you want to call it. So getting into and out of positions that you might not be into on the day-to-day and positions that you might be getting into in your workout, right? So there's a subjective quality to it, which I think this is the paradox. And of course it's a paradox because it's a part of life. Is it the way we make like remarkable objective improvements? So when I say objective improvements, it's, I'm getting stronger or I'm putting on, appreciable muscle mass or I'm gaining weight or losing weight, whatever the goal may be. These things are often got by subjective means. This looks better. This feels better. Things that are immeasurable, but hey, guess what? Why do people work out? Most people work out to feel good, right? And then if you feel good, then the looking good can come later. But it's the objective outcomes that are made possible by subjective means. So can you feel better in different positions? So when I think of warming up from a principles base, and we can get into what this looks like at like a per joint or per task level, like, hey, what do we do before a chest day or a back day or a lower or a leg day? But I think at the very least on my list, what I would be looking at as boxes to check, if you will, is, are we actually getting warm? Are the drills or activities we're doing increasing our heart rate and increasing our core body temperature? That'll be a really big piece for performance. And then on the flip side of that, and maybe not the flip side, but in addition to that, are we putting ourselves in a position to gain greater information about where our limbs are in space? Right? Like, that's going to be fundamental. It's going to be elemental to the motor learning process. And like you said, it's all learning. Can I get a concentration, a heavy dose, sometimes even greater than I might need? Can I create a buffer of this joint sense prior to training so that I eliminate that bottleneck to drive towards whatever stimulus I'm chasing in the bulk of my workout?
Yeah, I love that. And obviously, I come from a very similar place, and that's why we're both sitting in this call together. But I do want to expand on a couple of those things from my vantage point. Is first is not being special. If you understand how a human body works, you can do this process for anyone. It's everyone is somewhere on a spectrum of ability when it comes to shoulder, hip, core, spine, quad muscle, calf muscle. It doesn't matter what you're training or why you're training it. So the you not being special, the way that I would word that is that you need to understand how the human body works. If you understand how a shoulder works, you can apply that to anyone with a shoulder. If you understand the things that you're going to commonly see, then you can expedite the process of decision making around what you need to do when something presents. So understanding how essentially the underlying biomechanics, the anatomy of the movement that you're trying to create, whether that's shoulder, whether that's lower extremity, whether that's through the core, it doesn't matter how much we want to zoom in into isolation or zoom out into integration. It could be a bicep curl or it could be a snatch. If you understand how every link in that chain needs to work, then it expedites your process of understanding what you need to do to be able to warm up. Is that if I'm doing a snatch, I don't necessarily need to warm up my wrist, my elbow, my shoulder, my thoracic spine, my core stability, my hip, my knee, my ankle. I can integrate as many of those things as possible, and I can build awareness around the things that are not up to par or in up to the level that I need to do to be able to execute in my workout. And I could double down on that and not spend so much time worrying about all these other things that are just on the list. So that's one. Sorry,
Yeah,
we'll go one more.
it's just so odd that you so often you see a joint by joint approach. So I love that you
Yeah.
brought up like the like, look, let's do what's necessary, because you see people get run away in that Dunning Kruger effect where it's like, what are you doing? I'm mobilizing my big toe. It's like, whoa, you're gonna need
Yeah.
a longer lunch break, dog, because like you still got like 600 more joints to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So that's part of it in itself is understanding the underlying what do we need to be able to execute on, and then having the discernment to understand what doesn't matter. And then the second thing is you mentioned the word awareness. We both mentioned it so far, and that's kind of the process in which we founded this company on. But the mobility, stability, strength, that's why we trademarked that, because there's a very real implication on that, is that when we're starting to look at what we need to do in a workout, limitations are going to exist in that order, in your ability to access range of motion. So can we access the range of motion that we need to? Can we stabilize the range of motion that we need to? And then once we're able to do that, then we want to run current through the system. So a lot of times the warm up, it doesn't need to look very different from the actual exercise itself, but we want it to be something that we're going to challenge ourselves to a greater range of motion and a greater demand of stability than what we want to output in our main movement of that day.
Yeah, I mean, when you consider, and let's do this per region, I think this would be a valuable exercise in understanding that, look, we're not super specific, but shoulders are super specific to hips, right? The specificity lies in the region we're warming up, not in your particular region, right? Like your shoulder is sure. And don't get me wrong. Like when we start dealing at the pro athlete level, right? When we start dealing with the elite performer, the people where the 1% are really going to yield a big difference to the overall physical capacity that we're looking to build. Sure. But for most people, those things are going to be broadly fleshed out in the resistance training themselves, right? Not necessarily the shoulder remains the shoulder. Now, the specifics of what you want to do with the shoulder, and that is where the specificity comes into play. Like, I've dealt with everything from adhesive capsulitis in a clinical setting where someone has very little range of motion of the shoulder to pitchers on the New York Yankees that are throwing 100 miles an hour.
Yeah.
Guess what? This system that we're about to talk about right now, I feel like I'm selling a ShamWow on fucking late night TV. Is the same system, right? Because the specificity, it comes down to what they want to do with the shoulder when it's integrated properly, right? So, like, let's look at the shoulder first and foremost. Shoulder, we've used this comparison before, but I think it's super useful. It's like, I think of the shoulder and think of warm-ups or a principles-based approach to warming up the shoulder. Think of it like grade 11 chemistry, or whenever you learned chemistry in whatever country you're in and whatever school you learned it in. We learned this thing called a Bohr diagram. And there's a bunch of different analogies you can use. This is the one I like. So if we think about like a periodic table, right? Hydrogen, helium, lithium, beryllium, boron, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and we were to draw like the structure of it with its electrons. So you have like a nucleus, and then you have a first valence, and that has 2 electrons. And once you have 2 electrons in the first valence, so you have another valence, and there's 8 electrons, and so on. 8 electrons out into probably not infinity, but you're working your way through the periodic table. Now, the shoulder, the upper extremity at large, has a nucleus. That's your diaphragm, right? That's going to be the center of this upper extremity. Moving out from that, we have a rib cage. Moving out, and you could say rib cage and thoracic spine. Moving out from that, you have a scapula. Moving out from the scapula, you have a humerus, right? And then onward into the distal end of the humerus is the elbow, and then it articulates at the radius and the ulna, and into your forearm and your carpal rose and your wrist and your hand and all that. But as far as the shoulder goes, the valences that we're really going to focus on, and I want you guys, when you're listening to this, and share this with people who have shoulder pain. I swear to you, just trust me, we've done this enough. This fucking works. And it works because of specific variability, not just because of novelty. Because you're going to have people who go through shoulder warm-ups, shoulder drills, and your body takes to it because there's an element of new information that your body's getting from this particular drill. But you're blind to covering all the bases unless you have a principles-based approach and by which you're using to formulate these things. Most shoulder warm-ups that people do in the gym are more alike than they are different, which makes new drills beneficial if there's a meaningful percentage of difference than the drills they're already doing. So that's a key component, is understanding that this model of T-spine rib cage, right, scapula, humerus, and to some degree diaphragm, because there are breathing drills that can be beneficial. The diaphragm and its articulation with the rib cage need to be taken into account. But more often than not, when you guys are looking to build a warm-up, what I would do is I would categorize all the warm-up drills under this, right? I would categorize I would use it as a filtering system. I would use it as like filtering criteria for all the drills that you see, because what this will allow you to do is be flexible, right? Like, we look at like flexible dieting, like IIFYM, if it fits your macros, IIFYM, if it fits your mechanics, right? Like, think about that's a trend. You heard it here first, RX Radio, Pat Pending, holla at your boy. It's like, when you look at that, it's like you can plug and play, right? Which is a really nice, like, it's a movement Mad Lib that you can run. So let's take like a T-spine drill, right? Like a thread the needle or around the world, or T-spine extension over a foam roller, or some sort of lateral flexion rib cage movement, or posterior expansion drills. Whatever you see, be like, I'm going to pick one of these drills. Now, look, some of these drills are going to push you in a position that you're already in. And guess what? You're not going to benefit from it. And you'll be able to tell that because your performance isn't going to improve, right? You're not going to see a huge spike in performance as you go through your session. So what do you do next time? Well, you A/B test it, right? You're going to I'm going to do something different. I'm going to do a different T-spine drill. I'm going to replace it, right? So look at all the exercise you're doing for your upper body sessions, or if you're building a warm-up, and use this heuristic, right? So you end up at at most, and this is the key, at most you're going to have 4 drills. You're going to have 4 drills. And it's a contained system that should never be more than that in cases that we're not dealing with acute injury rehab or post-op or something along those lines. For most people, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at cycling through 4 drills. A T-spine drill, a scapula drill, maybe an internal external rotation drill, right? And when we come across a new drill, we just sub it in, right? And we keep finding. Now, look, you might not dig into the biomechanics, and you might, through understanding your own outcomes from a performance, like how does that feel? How are your training sessions after these warm-up drills? You can start to tease out, without knowing anything about mechanics, what your body is going to take to, because it will respond in kind in the workouts that you're doing. You're going to start to see the needle move a little bit when it comes to your performance. You're going to start to see your lifts go up or your pain go down or your position or technique improve as a consequence. Now, you'll expedite this process further if you know the specific variability that you need, right? Like some people might need more T-spine rotation or trunk rotation over T-spine extension and flexion. That's something that can be discerned by a trained eye, but you don't need to be a trained eye. You just need to control your variables, right? So when we look at the upper body, those are the big rocks that we're going to look at. And so if you filter all of things down, a lot of the exercises you're doing are more alike in one of these categories than different, and standing in a
Chestnut
different
emoji. Sorry.
chestnut emoji. Yeah, that'll make sense to Matt Penny when he listens to this. So when we look at it, it's almost like, and I use this comparison called what's it called? They do it with a personality test. It's a I'm blanking on the term. Factor analysis. So a factor analysis is, if we think about personality, right? Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. It's like, that's a really weird list of 5 things that all personalities can be described as. And it's like, well, no, that's the root of all aspects of personality, right? And we come to this list through factor analysis by saying, like, someone who's happy, someone is jovial, someone is kind. It's like, are those 3 things more alike than they are different? It's like, yeah, they are, right? So you could look at a Y raise, a W raise, a T raise, and an I raise and be like, are those more alike than they are different? Like, yeah. In the eyes of your, third eye, your 6th sense, your body's kind of moving through the same plane with the same muscles at the same joints, not in a way different enough to be meaningful to the nervous systems, the skeleton, the musculoskeletal system. So this is when we look at upper body, building an upper body warm up, I want you guys to go out, find all your drills, write them all down and be like, okay, which one of these are T-spine and rib cage? Thread the needle around the world. T-spine rotation, trunk rotation, lateral flexion drills. Bucket those. Scapular drills. Retraction, protraction, upward rotation, downward rotation, band pull aparts, push ups with a plus, all those, write those down. Internal rotation drills, cable internal rotation, pec stretching, lat stretching, pullovers, external rotation drills, cable external rotations, kettlebell bottom under press, scaps, or dead hang scap sets, which are like external rotation and scap drills at the same time. Pull aparts, face pulls, those all have an external, and then just run the playbook. Run an Mad Lib of 1 through 4, and then here's the key, and this will be true of all warm-ups. Integrate your warm-up into your workouts. What does that mean? It means if me and Jay are running a 4x100 meter relay, and I'm going to be the first guy because I'm slow as fuck, and he's got to make up ground for my slow ass, and I pass him the baton, Jay is already in motion for that second leg of the race. Your warm up is the first leg of the race, right? It happens on the track. This is part of the exercise. It's part of the stimulus. So I'm going to pass the rock to him while Jay is already moving. So what does that mean in terms of training? It means as I go through these 4 drills for the upper extremity, I'm going to integrate it with the first exercise of my program for the day. Let's make it super simple for all of you. Let's say bench press. So we go, I'm going to do a T-spine drill, scap, internal, external rotation. I'm going to pair at the end of my external rotation drill, I'm going to pair that with my first set of bench press. Maybe it's the empty bar. maybe it's 95 pounds, maybe it's 135. And then what I do is we enter back into this loop, this circuit, and now we go T-spine, rib cage, scap, internal, external rotation. My warm-up is heavier in between, right? Warming up should be such an expedient process that, as you kind of alluded to, as you build that awareness over time, it becomes something that you can gauge day by day, right? And not only can you gauge day by day from the volume of your warm-up, you can take that information that you're getting from your warm-up and actually help gauge and dictate your workout to come, right? I sometimes extend my warm up out and I cut my workout down. Why? Because the idea that I need to warm up more tells me that I'm not ready for load. So what I usually do, if I do 2, 3, 4 rounds of warm up and I get into 3 or 4 rounds, I'm still not feeling good. I'm looking at like, okay, I don't want to warm up all day. I still want to drive some stimulus. What are the exercises I'm doing? Where are my opportunities to work around me feeling shit today? I'm going to use this free weight thing and do it as a machine. My elbows are a little bit pissed off. I was going to do a bilateral preacher curl, doing preacher curl with both arms. I'm going to do it with one arm instead. Right.
Mhm.
So it's a really good data collection process, right? It lets you know, what did you get to the starting line and do we need to move the finish line? That's what warming up should be about, is understanding those two components. Can we consistently start our workout at a neurological and physical and physiological starting line? And if not, do I need to move the finish line if I have to move the starting line? Sometimes we move the starting line up. Today feels pretty good. Full send. Sometimes I got to move the starting line, further back. Hey, where's the finish line? I got to bring that finish line forward, right? Today's not it. So you can gauge overall stimulus if you're aware and open to receiving the information that your warm-ups give you. And I think a lot of people just look at efficacy of warming up and they get lazy. They go, static stretching causes injuries. Warming up is bad. It's like, dude, go rub two sticks together to make fire, you fucking Neanderthal. Like, can we have a conversation about training human beings here? It's there's so many elements to warming up that make it useful. And I think understanding the starting line and the finish line and how warming up gives us data about where to place those is super important.
Yeah. I want to take a second to simplify the assessment process for people that maybe they don't have as much of a background in anatomy, physiology, biomechanics as probably some of the listeners do. If we look at literally any movement that we do, we can break it down into an arc of rotation through 3 planes, right? Through flexion, extension, lateral flexion, or rotation. As we look at that, a lot of people will build their workout around some sort of bilateral loading exercise. We'll say a squat, a back squat, right? We're moving through 3 planes at the hip through an arc of rotation in each of those planes. The goal in assessing yourself in the warm up to get ready for your squat should be to reduce asymmetries in those arcs of rotation. Right. So if we're looking at it through flexion extension of the hip, I should be able to go through a process relatively quickly to assess my ability to move through flexion and extension to a degree that is greater than what's going to be demanded out of my squat. Same thing with adduction, abduction, same thing with external, internal rotation. And I think a lot of people get kind of lost in the weeds when they say, oh, well, I bias external rotation over here or internal rotation over here. You don't need to know that. No one needs to know that. What you need to know is that your arc of rotation is asymmetrical from left to right. So if you can go through the process of, it can be incredibly simple. It could be a figure 4 stretch, not necessarily to stretch your muscles out to gain passive length in your muscles, but to build awareness of, oh, it feels tight when I try to rotate my right hip and it doesn't feel tight when I try to rotate my left hip. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to double down on creating that rotation through the hip that feels tight because I have a lack or I have an asymmetry in my ability to rotate from right to left. So I'm going to take the time to create a more symmetrical degree of rotation in both hips before I go and I load bilaterally. Because once you introduce bilateral loading, you're going to bias whatever movement pattern is easiest for you to move through, which is probably going to be asymmetrical if you don't take the time to understand where your biases lie in that arc of rotation through all three planes. And that's why you said upper body movement. I know you're talking about the valences, that we don't need more than 4 movements. But I'll simplify down is that you don't really need to assess outside of the 3 planes of movement, your arc of rotation in the 3 planes of movement for the joints involved in the exercise. So that's going to look a little bit different depending on where we're at. But we could even look at, like, the upper body is, we can look at rotation, lateral flexion, and flexion extension. Each of those is an arc of rotation through the spine. So if I'm stuck in a flexed thoracic spine, that means that I need to get into the other side of that range of motion that I'm not biased towards, so that I have that variability through the spine, so I can create rib cage positions that are going to be conducive to me moving my scapula the way I need to when I'm doing my upper body thing. So that's, I know that was probably not simple. It was meant to be simple, but if you look at this in arcs of rotation, the goal is to find out where you are and to get into the position that you're not, so that you at least have the ability to control that and adjust your positioning outside of what you bias, so that you can create more symmetrical positions in your bilateral loading movements.
You've been hanging out with me too long, dog. Someone's going to listen to this and be like, all right, Jits is here to translate. And then he was like, arc of rotation, sagittal, frontal, transverse, bilateral. They're like, God damn it.
Yeah, I fucked it.
I mean, I think you said too much caffeine. I know that's what you're going to say.
Yeah.
If we think lower extremity, I think I'm going to double down on what you just said, and we're going to bring it to the hip now, because I think it's super useful. And I think, so the funny thing is intuition gets people pretty far. And I think people who study exercise really undervalue intuition. Don't pay enough attention to what intuition and instinct tells people to do, because it doesn't. I know at no point in training general population is it more apparent to me, anyways. I'm not sure why it is, because you start to see some of the sophistication that comes out of intuition. There's just a few tweaks that we want to make. But when I watch, like, new to the gym people start warming up, it's fascinating to me how they embody some really crucial principles of biomechanics, and they do it without knowing a goddamn thing, right? So what gets me, and you guys have all seen this, is, so when Jay was talking about, like, hey, here's like a really core principle of warming up: make sure that at the ball and socket joints that we can get movement through, flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, or lateral flexion, and rotation. If we can do that, and we can do that equal on both sides, like, we're pretty good. If we can't, maybe we should try to do that before we go loading, especially in bilateral settings where the compensations will pass the buck off to the other hip. You don't got ER in that hip, guess what? You're going to have to do it more in the other hip. You're going to have to demand more of the other side. 3 planes of motion. If you're, advanced in fitness and you guys understand this well, great. If you're sending this to someone who's not so advanced, take the time to learn this. So, moving front to back, side to side, and rotation. Watch someone in the gym before they do some sort of lower body movement. They will do the following: they're going to swing their leg front and back. They're going to swing their leg side to side, and then they're going to start rotating their trunk. It is so eerily consistent how people adopt front to back, side to side rotation, right? Like, whether it's through the trunk, whether it's through the hip and doing some sort of leg swing. Then again, intuition gets you close. Now, something that I would look at in kind of taking that idea from you, going, hey, look, 3 planes of movement, let's see how we do. Lower extremity, I think that's a really good heuristic to follow. But rather than doing fucking leg swings and hanging onto the squat rack, see if you can do that same thing with your foot on the ground, right? Closed versus open chain. So you want to build awareness at the hip. Great, right? We have this really strong joint at the hip, much stronger and more structurally stable than the ball and socket at the shoulder. Rather than doing leg swings front to back, side to side, spinning your pelvis around, keep your leg in one place. Single leg RDLs, hip airplanes. Though that is going to give you the variability in, hey, look, think about what's happening at that hip socket, right? Can we, with the femur staying in the same place, if you're not following along on YouTube, I suggest you do, with the femur staying in the same place, can I move the pelvis around? Can I move the pelvis around a femur that's fixed, right? When my leg stays in one place, because when I'm going on a leg press, when I'm going on a hack squat, my leg is going to be fixed, and it's my pelvis moving around my leg that's going to create motion, right? Like you made a quip earlier, but like the hacky sack thing, it's like no one really cares because it doesn't transfer over if I can do a bunch of internal rotation with my hip not loaded. What's going to matter is when I stand on one leg, and then you'll see people will default to being like pretty good or at least better front to back, little bit tighter side to side, and then super tight in rotation. It's like, well, we're going to have to clear up some of that perception, that some of that lack of awareness. And if you do that clearing up process in a closed chain, this becomes a longer term solution, right? Because you're going to have awareness in positions that are transferable, which means like if I can stretch my hip, like let's say like a pigeon stretch, for example, pretty common, and you can get a transient relief of that or transient improvement of external rotation, of your external rotators, which will improve internal rotation. You can get a transient release and increase in awareness, sure. But if you think about like closing down your hip in a single leg RDL, you're creating a relatively similar joint position. You're just doing it in a closed chain, which means your foot's on the ground, which is going to be exactly where you need to have that perception to minimize that tightness when you're actually under load. Because in most cases, your foot's going to be on a platform or the ground, and it's going to be your pelvis that's moving around in space. So getting really used to the relative relationship of your femur next to your pelvis. So like, we kind of simplified it as best we could and with the upper extremity. And we're like, yo, if you do some T-spine, ribcage, scap, and some humerus stuff, or rotation stuff with the humerus, you're probably going to be in a really good spot if things are coming through relatively consistently and symmetrically. And if not, let's try and to use a James Thayerism, let's try and really paint the edges, right? Let's try and really get to the outer limits of our awareness of where our body is in space at each one of these particular joints. At the lower body, we can look at something like a single leg RDL, right? People stretch their hamstrings, people stretch their glutes. It's like, okay, let's just do a single leg RDL. You're probably going to get more than adequate range if you can do both. Now, some of you aren't going to be stable enough to do that. Hang on to the squat rack, hang on to a bench, get some external stability in the early stages, and to what degree you could tolerate it, slowly start to wean yourself off that. All right. Then think of something like, I really like something like a sprinter pose, which actively brings your hip into flexion, right? If you actively bring one hip into flexion, you're passively leaving another hip in extension, right? So going from a single leg RDL where your chest is facing the floor, you're standing on one leg, you're supported, good stretch in the hamstring and glute, and then contract that glute to bring that hip and pelvis forward to start getting some length into the front of the hip. Right? If I'm contracting my glute and keeping my ribs down and bringing my other hip up, like I'm at the top of a sprint, I'm going to get a pretty good stretch through the groin. I'm going to get a pretty good stretch to the TFL, maybe the rectus femoris. I'm going to get my hip, out of that flex position. I'm going to start to get it into what will start to look like an extended position. And then from there, we start to move side to side, right? So we start to do something where in a single leg RDL position, we call it a hip airplane. We're going to get a lot of abduction and rotation in conjunction with one another, right? So if you can do that and you can, as Thayer would say, paint the edges of your hip socket, you're going to be in a really good place to start loading, right? That's specific variability. That's not novelty, because you'll watch people do, I did a couch stretch and I did this banded thing and I did this and I did that. It's like you did the same thing 7 different ways, but you're missing, 2, cardinal planes of motion. You're leaving them out in the cold, right? Where if you did 3 less things, but 2 more ranges, you'd be way better off and way more prepared than doing one plane 6 times.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a concept that people maybe just don't know or don't understand or don't apply in their warm-ups when they're having these super redundant warm-ups is the idea of why we actually don't have access to the range of motion we need access to. And it's a pretty simple answer. I'm sure you can explain this in a much more artful or scientific way, but it kind of boils down to the idea that we can't stabilize that range of motion, right? Is that our body's not going to let us move or produce force in a range of motion that it doesn't necessarily trust us to do so, or it thinks that something, maybe injury will happen if we move a certain way, or we don't have the capacity to stabilize it. So it's not going to let us move that way. So as we're talking about this process of rotating through three planes, or understanding the mechanics that we need to do, or painting the edges, and understanding what we need to accomplish in a warm up, it really boils down to understanding that we need to be able to stabilize that range of motion. So when we're starting off and we notice these asymmetries, the reason that we have an asymmetry is because you have a decreased capacity to stabilize that arc of rotation, or that portion of that arc of rotation. So your body's going to pull you into the other side of that arc. So you'll see it all the time in people, especially in their hips, is if you look down at your feet and one of your feet is just turned out to the side, your body's stabilizing through external rotation. Because in the hip, we don't have a great capacity, or we don't have very many muscles, or a very strong advantage to create internal rotation. But we have a ton of muscles that create external rotation. So if we have a poor understanding or a poor ability to decrease capacity to control internal rotation, your brain, your nervous system is going to tell your muscles, hey, like, we're not moving that way. We're going to put some resting muscle tone into these external rotators to force you into external rotation. And we're going to keep you there because we don't trust you to move through internal rotation. So the process then in the warm up needs to become, all right, I'm going to do something to gain access to internal rotation. Sorry. So that could be some of the more passive things. That could be static stretching, chestnut. That could be static stretching. That could be foam rolling. It could be banded distraction. Whatever you want to choose that's going to allow you or grant you greater access to move actively into internal rotation. And then we need to have some sort of stimulus of control over that range of motion before we try to produce force. So it's a lot of people will double down, triple down, quadruple down on getting into that range of motion that they're deficient in, but then they'll just completely skip the step where they're actually gaining the control in that range of motion. And that's the piece that's going to allow us to access that over and over again. That's going to be the piece that allows us to gain ownership over that range of motion, as opposed to just kind of transiently be there. So that's what Jordan's talking about when he's saying painting the edges through that hip rotation, that things like the hip airplane, is that we're actually putting ourselves in an unstable position, a position that our nervous system doesn't trust us that we can control. And what we have to do is we have to prove our ownership over that range of motion. We have to prove to ourselves that we can stabilize, that we can buffer force in that range of motion before our body's going to allow us to actually stay there, live there, and produce force there. So that's a key concept that people need to understand when they're going through this assessment process of, okay, I'm biasing one side of this arc of rotation. Now, for me to actually get back through that full arc of rotation and be able to access that easier over time, I need to show a stimulus of control. I don't need to just loosen it up and then bomb into some squats and then probably come back and feel worse the next day, because we still don't have the control over that range of motion. So that's the piece of this that can't be overlooked. That's the piece of this that's going to allow us to progress this on top of each other, as opposed to starting from the same spot, spending 45 minutes getting that rotation passively and then doing our squats. No, we need to do minimal effective dose to gain as much of that range of motion as we can, and then maximal effective dose of stabilizing that range of motion so we can continue to increase our capacity to hold those positions against greater demands over time.
Yeah, and I think this is where the warm-up crowd and the critiques against warm-up, it's not brought full picture in a lot of cases. Like another analogy that I really like with a warm-up is the idea of an airplane, like the idea of a systems check. So when you get on a plane, you got the pilot, he's up front, first officer, they're kind of sitting in the cockpit, and before they can take off, they need to run a systems check, right? And what are the different systems? I don't know. Instrumentation, communication, the fucking landing gear. Did someone close the door to the gas cap? Like, I don't know, whatever the fuck pilots got to do, right?
Yeah.
And these systems checks are, once they're done, the plane takes off. And if not, you're stuck at Pearson Airport while some asshole is under there closing the gas cap or whatever, right? And then once the glass cap is closed, the fucking plane takes off. Now, sometimes, this is why I fly in the morning, travel hack, fly in the morning, first flight's out, you're going to run into less of these issues. Veteran move, you're welcome. You deal with you're waking up at 4 a.m. when you get there, but at least you'll get there. But looking at some of these accesses to range of motion, internal rotation of the hip, right? It's movement through the scapula, through the rib cage, all of these different things. It just becomes systems checks over time. And guess what? You're going to run this with a novice lifter, and you might even run it with yourself and be like, this system is not giving me a green light. It's giving me a yellow light. It's like, okay, like that's fine. Most commercial airlines now, we can run off of one engine, right? Which is correct, which is nuts. I prefer flying an Airbus A380 or a 747 because the 747 Airbus A380 have two engines on each wing, and that just makes me feel safe. So now if one of them goes down, I have three more engines, which, that's just a plain nerd thing to do. But technically speaking, you can land the thing with one plane. It's not like helicopters. Like helicopters, like there's a fucking paper bag and all of a sudden you're Kobe. Like it's over, dog. So like helicopters, different thing. But planes, it's like, all right, cool. Like, does it mean not work out? No. And that's a big problem because there's warm up crowd people out there who are like, oh, you can't do this. Everything's dangerous. It's like, it's not dangerous. We're just throwing some caution flags out there that, look, we need to fix this before we go on a long haul, right? Like no one's going to take off 10 minutes outside of an airport on an 18-hour flight, Singapore to Newark, longest flight in the world. You didn't know you were going to get plane knowledge. You come for the biomechanics, you stay for the plane knowledge.
Damn.
Yeah, I know. It's big. Singapore to Newark Airport, longest
New
flight
Jersey. That's got to be the best redeeming quality of New Jersey.
Yeah, it's it. Imagine leaving the bustling metropolis of gorgeous Singapore, a country, nation, state that is just thriving, and then getting off and having two Somali cab drivers beating the shit out of each other on the interstate. It's like, Newark is trash. EWR, if you ever see that airport code, EWR, GTFO. Like that is the worst. Fly into JFK, Delta second terminal, whatever. Like we could do a whole travel podcast if we want. Point being, they turn into systems checks. Right. And these are things we're just looking to subjectively improve. And as we start to subjectively improve them, we're going to get objectively stronger. How are we going to test this? Because we're going to actually start pushing weight, right? We're going to start to beat the book, so to speak, on movements that are going to be key indicators, squats or split squats, or even some cases, depending on skill level, leg press. Going to want to get stronger. Now, the thing is, once we check the system, I walk into the gym. If I'm on my feet all day, we do a couple airplanes, we do a couple, maybe do a couple windmills, upper body stuff. And hey, like I feel good. Sweet. Let's bring that start line up. Let's get this plane onto the runway. Let's taxi this bitch. And next thing you know, we're about 160, 170 miles an hour before a plane takes off. Just, a whole bunch of fun facts for the dinner table about flying. And then all of a sudden you're in the air. And it's like, hey, we got a full tank of gas here. We got green lights on systems checks. I can fly this bitch as fast or as long as I want. So I can move the finish line. Hey, we hit a bunch of birds taking off. I don't feel really good. We're dealing with one engine and a landing gear that's, faulty. Sometimes, what you got to do? You know what your warm up tells you? You got to fucking sully it. If you ever seen that movie, sometimes you got to land the bitch in the Hudson, right? And it's the systems checks that's going to tell you that, right? So these are, I think, some ways of looking at warming up that really break the straw men argument that people put around warming up. Because what your long-term warm-up is going to be? How heavy your split squat is. You know what your long-term warm-up is going to be? How many pull-ups you can do. You know what your long-term warm-up is going to be? Is how much can you single-arm dumbbell row over time. But we got to check those systems. We got to get this bitch in the air. We got to get some daylight under our wings, and we really got to get moving first. And that's the thing. We look at warm-ups as a continuum over time relative to our overall strength and skill. But guess what builds that strength and skill? It's the foundation of these systems to begin with, right? So I see a lot of people flying with a clip wing. It's like, dude, you're never going to go far. I go back to my home gym all the time, and there's like a couple of dudes who get it. And every time I see them, they're a little bit bigger and they're a little bit stronger. They have a lot of variability in their movement, they're constantly checking their systems, right? But for the most part, it's been 15 years of guys that look exactly the same. And it's like, dude, you're running into your bottlenecks too early, right? You're running into these systems checks. These systems are failing you. And that's why that's failure to launch, dog. So when we think about building a warm up, your shoulder, hip, whether you want to look at it through, the valence lens or the planar lens, the arc of rotation lens, like pick your systems. Know that your communications is completely different than landing gear. They have to be different, right? Like we're not looking at, can my scapula upwardly rotate? Can my shoulder flex? It's like upward rotation and shoulder flexion are the same thing, right? So we're really testing the same thing there. What is it? Do your factor analysis, or just listen to us and do the shit we tell, but use it as a starting point to build awareness. And then over time, everything in your workout becomes your warm up for tomorrow.
Yeah. Bars. Spider-Man meme is me looking at Jay.
I would drop this mic, but it's expensive.
That's it.
Yeah. We did it.
We did it,
we
man.
Solved it.
This is the GOAT warm-up podcast.
Look, I got to look. Next year, 2024 is the year of RX Radio. We have been around for 8 years. The enemy is at the gate. And guess what? Don't worry. It's old people. It's boomers. It's fucking boomers. They're the reason you can't afford a house. And all of a sudden, the old people are back in charge. And you know what? We can't get them out of government. We can't get them out of getting the early reservations. We can't get them out of their homes. But we can get them out of podcasting. So for nothing more than a share on IG and a text message to your friend, we can beat these old fuckers out of the fitness industry on podcasting. RX Radio, the antidote to boomer fitness. Thank you for your time. All right. Okay.
I got nothing.
You're just, why do I keep doing this with this guy? All right, guys. Hey, I appreciate you guys hanging out. If you guys like it, obviously share, subscribe, and all that stuff on Spotify. It means a lot, makes a difference. And we're coming for the old people. We're coming for all of them. We're going to we're just going to be wheelchairs in the streets. It's just going to be nothing but zone 2 cardio and rucksack hikes with fucking, barefoot shoes on. We're going to smoke them all. We're going to smoke them all. This is our year.
Fuck.
The old people got to go. They're out. They're out the game. Done. Off with their heads. Send them off on their last hike, right? Change their meds. Fuck with their resveratrol and the sunshine on their balls. I just can't do it with these old people. We're taking over. I've had enough. RX Radio, guys. Appreciate it. We'll see you next week.
See you guys.